So we're working through step one of our two-step apologetic. The classical apologetics typically goes through step one, which would be the philosophical proofs for God existence, and then the step two would be the evidential proof. How do we know that what the Bible says is true? How can we prove the Bible? How do we know Jesus rose from the dead? So right now we're on step one. Last week we did the cosmological argument and the Kalam cosmological argument, as well as the teleological argument. So cosmological argument is especially looking for the cause of the whole universe. You look at everything around you, it has to have a cause, and so the most logical explanation is that cause would be God. Something making everything around us is a lot more plausible than everything coming from nothing. So God makes a whole lot more sense than your typical materialist explanation for the rise of everything that we see around us. Then we did the teleological argument, which is looking at the fine-tuning of everything. So instead of saying, well, everything that exists must have a cause, the earth exists, therefore it must have a cause, instead the teleological argument looks at everything around us and says, wow, there is incredible fine-tuning to all of these systems. Just the human body, had it not had everything in place all at the same time, you have a human species where nobody has developed or evolved or been given eyes yet. Well, the human species isn't going to make it very far if nobody can see anything. You have a mammal that doesn't have lungs. Well, suddenly you have no life at all, because without lungs, cellular respiration dies and the organism ceases to exist.
Where's the blood going?
Yeah, where's the blood go? You have to have all the systems in place for the body to function. So that's why the teleological argument is actually a very, very strong argument for especially creation, but taking the step further from that, the existence of God. Then we are now on the Leibnizian argument. I don't know if it's formally called the Leibnizian argument, but it's Leibniz's cosmological argument, and that's where we're at today. So working through these things, we're going to see how Leibniz answers these questions. Why do you believe in God? How do you know God exists? And this will help us prepare to be able to give people a reason for the hope that lies within. So with that, we're on the Leibniz argument, point D, if you have your outline. So this was started by Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, who lived from 1646 to 1716. Essentially, the core of his idea that he was putting forward is that the universe must have a sufficient cause. So this is very similar to like the classic cosmological argument, but he did develop it. So what he's doing is he's looking at the principle of sufficient reason. And why does something exist rather than nothing? Most logically, it would make a lot more sense for nothing to exist. But there's something here, so why is that here? The universe itself is something that would not be here on its own. So that's where we come up with this term contingent. So you have like contingencies built into a plan. Well, for contingencies, you have to have a main plan. For a contingent universe, you have to have something else. You have to have a higher plane of reality, a higher plane of truth, something else that exists that is behind the existence of the world around us. So the physical world, matter itself, is contingent. It depends on something outside of itself. When you look at everything that we see, absolutely everything in reality is contingent except for God. God is what Leibniz referred to as the necessary being. Because he is self-existent, he does not have any contingencies. He is not contingent on any other being or any other existence. In himself, he exists, and he doesn't require anything else for his existence. Human beings require air for our existence. We require water. We require food. We are contingent. We have a lot of requirements to allow us to exist. But God himself does not have those requirements. So according to this argument, the universe is contingent, meaning it could have failed to exist, and therefore requires an external cause to explain its existence. So the sufficient reason for the existence of the universe must be found outside of the universe in a necessary being, which would be God, whose existence is self-explanatory. So here's the basic syllogism, the logic behind this argument. Everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. The universe exists, and its explanation is God. Therefore, God exists as the explanation of the universe. So people like to come up with objections to this argument, and so one of the main objections that evolutionists will have is, well, if you believe God created the world, who created God? Where did God come from? And they're really falling back on that infinite regress argument. But their own worldview has the same problem. Yes?
I saw a video yesterday that absolutely disappointed me. Because this guy that claims that he's a Christian, but he's also a big mythology nerd, was doing short videos on where do gods come from. And he just lists off how all the origins of God. And it gets to our God. It's like, there was nothing, and then he decided to be something. I was like,
he decided to be something?
Yes. I'm like, wait a second. That's not very sound with the Bible, mister.
No.
And then I very much disagree with how he describes how God and Jesus exist. No.
Yeah, that's not accurate with
the Bible,
Jewish theology,
yeah,
with Christian theology, or with even, you want to pull in Catholicism or Greek Orthodoxy.
It wasn't even funny.
There's nothing even in alignment with Greek philosophy that works out that way. It
would have been way funnier. Besides, it probably would have been way funnier if he's like, he existed long before anybody else, so he's always existed. There you go. Which would have been made a very funny video, but
yeah. Was he trying to be comedic in his video?
I think so, while also saying facts. But
yeah, so he's definitely not a theologian. No, God in himself exists. And for the human mind, everything that we know has a beginning. Everything we know is contingent. But to actually comprehend a necessary being is really outside of our understanding.
Exactly.
To even say that God existed before everything, it's like, well, he created time, so even describing him as existing in eternity past, eternity is a time measurement. So philosophically, there isn't an eternity past.
Yeah.
He simply existed before that. And in that, it doesn't make a lot of conscious sense to us, other than recognizing that he is a necessary being. Without God, nothing else could exist.
Yeah. Which is where a lot of things fall apart with people, especially when it comes to the other mythologies that pop out that always seem to have the origins.
Yes. Well, and to Leibniz's point, he is a sufficient cause for everything we see around us. And then you can fall back on the teleological argument to say, and furthermore, not just the existence of matter, but then the matter has been fine-tuned. So there's a lot of power and care that goes into God making us and creating the universe around us. But that objection that a lot of people have is one that people go to a lot, because if you think, well, everything has to have a beginning, well, eventually, at some point, your regress has to end.
Yes.
And that's the problem with evolutionary worldview, and also with the Mormon worldview.
Yeah.
Both of those religious groups are making a faith claim. One is saying the Big Bang created everything, and if it wasn't the Big, or what caused the Big Bang was the universe that existed before that collapsed on itself down to the size of a pin, the size of a pin's head.
Oh yeah.
And then that tiny bit of super dense matter exploded and created everything. And then we're just going to all eventually compress back down, and it's going to explode again, and it just goes through this compression and expansion cycle.
That's definitely not happening.
And it just exists forever. Well, but that's the evolutionary claim. But all the evidence that we have says that is not true.
Yeah, the evidence that we have says that God is the beginning.
Mm-hmm. So right now, evolutionists really, like on the academic level, not necessarily the Dawkins type characters out there who are the big apologists arguing for the view, but the philosophers behind the view are either jumping ship and becoming some kind of a theist, or they're trying to find some other explanation for the existence of the universe, because they know that the Big Bang has been debunked about 15 different ways. So because of that, within the academic world, it's really losing a whole lot of credibility. For how we respond to this objection of infinite regress, we can go back to saying that God is a necessary being, he is self-existent, and he is uncaused. This argument avoids infinite regress and does not rely on the universe having a beginning, focusing instead on the need for an ultimate explanation for existence itself. So other people want to have further objections and say, well, can the universe explain itself? Well, the universe is contingent, right? So if the universe is contingent things cannot explain themselves. Only a necessary being can be its own explanation. So in and of itself, simply reality existing is not a sufficient explanation. There is not sufficient cause for the universe to be self-existent. So what do we do with the scientific explanations that are out there? Physics tries to describe how the universe operates now, but it cannot answer why it exists at all. So they try and say, planets started out as this big ether. It was like a thick fluid just floating in space after the Big Bang. And slowly, as stuff started to continue to spread out from the energy of the explosion, dispersed everything, eventually particles started to bump into each other and stick together. And as the particles grew, they started to have a gravitational effect where they're pulling the thick fluid of matter towards themselves, and slowly gravity eventually began to pull from clouds of dust and rock into a solid object that created what was eventually going to turn into planets and stars.
You're saying the physicists think, because it's very contrary, because we know what's inside the cores of most of the planets, basically. But
Yes.
They're basically saying that all the planets are basically just giant jelly-filled donuts.
Yes, and so they call it the coalescing, where the gravitational effects of particles bumping into each other and sticking together begin to pull more and more matter towards themselves and form solid objects, gas giants, and stars.
They've lost me. I'm just going to keep thinking.
Now, here's the problem. Based on the physics of the Big Bang, physicists are saying, well, that doesn't explain everything around us. That doesn't work. Because that kind of an explosion would just lead to chaos. And if everything was so densely packed, we would have seen more of a mixture of particles. We wouldn't have, as you described, a different kind of material in different layers of the atmosphere. Like, why would you have a planet with a core of iron with some other kind of material on the outside? Well, with that, and then as well, the existence of gas giants that don't have solid matter in them, even though they have a great amount of gravity, and you have gas giant planets that have different compositions than our planet has. well, why do we see so much variety out there in space if it was this big fluid mixture? It would have mixed more than what we see. But instead, we see a lot of variety in all the different planetary bodies. The objects in the universe are not all uniform. Physicists don't have an explanation for that. And so that's another reason why people are beginning to abandon the evolutionary explanation for the existence of reality. So, continuing on, we have the example section. Leibniz would say, if you're looking at a building, someone had to have built the structure. And so if you go to someone and you say, hey, look at this huge church building, this is amazing. Did your child build this? They would look at you like you're an idiot, because even though a child is a intelligent being, they have incredible functionality, they are not a sufficient cause. Like a child in themselves could not have built a building. They would have had to grow and develop and gain strength and understanding and intelligence and be able to build something like the building we have around us. So a child, while it is a possible cause, it is not a sufficient cause. The building itself being contingent and the person being the cause of the building. Then the idea of contingency versus a necessary being. This can be illustrated with a candle's flame and how the candle itself depends on a match that's going to light it. The match itself depends on external causes. So as you go down the line, you have this series, this chain of necessary causes. Only a necessary source is self-explanatory. So once you get something that is self-sufficient, self-governing, a being in and of itself, then you finally get to the sufficient cause for everything around us. And you don't have to keep going down this chain of contingency of, well, the candle's lit, so there had to be a match to light it. And if the match lit it, there had to be a matchbox to strike on. And if you had a matchbox to strike on, you must have had someone who went and mined sulfur to create the lighting strip. And you keep going down the line, and there's a cause and a cause and a cause behind everything. But eventually you get back to God, who is necessary and has no cause. Then for our third example, looking at daily observations, objects in the natural world, things like trees, planets, and ecosystems, are contingent, and their existence points to an underlying necessary cause. So if we're putting this in the framework of Scripture, you look at Psalm 19, and it says, the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament showeth his handiwork, day unto day showeth forth speech, night unto night, or uttereth speech, night unto night showeth forth knowledge. There's no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out into all the earth. Why do we have that description of creation? It transcends language. It transcends culture. When people look at creation, they can see that everything around is contingent and that there is a necessary being behind the creation of everything. And just as like a fun Hebrew side note, where it says day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth forth knowledge, there is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. In Hebrew, the day is speaking, and it is telling the next day about God.
I like it.
It's and the nights are like gossiping with each other. So it's one day to the next, as one day is passing and the next day is starting, as they shake hands between the juncture from one 24-hour period to the next. They're sharing the gossip real quick so that this guy can go and share gossip down the line.
Only the Jews actually utilized talking to the next generation, like how the day's talking to the next day.
Yeah, and there are those who do it well, and it is a wonderful example for us to learn from. We need to be teaching the next generation. But yes, so in creation, the world around us, we see things that are contingent, that had to have had a designer, and so this cosmological argument can lead us straight back to the teleological argument. If everything around us appears to be designed, then there must have been a designer behind it. And then lastly, we'll talk about the ontological argument. So the ontological argument is the argument for the greatest conceivable being. And this argument is actually, it's really heady, like it's very philosophical and a lot to wrap your head around. And then even once you really grasp it, it's kind of a struggle to see what its purpose and how effective it is. But for people who are very intellectual, who want a deep philosophical reason behind why they believe, this can be helpful for those. So especially for trying to get a good gotcha in a philosophical debate, or for someone who is genuinely seeking and really values philosophy. In those two cases, this can be helpful. But for most people, we don't really care about this argument a whole lot. But it's out there and it can be helpful. So we can work through it very quickly here. Essentially, the ontological argument is a philosophical approach to proving God's existence through logical reasoning rather than empirical evidence. The core premise this argument makes is that God is the being than whom no greater can be conceived. So let's read that definition again. The being than whom no greater being can be conceived. So essentially, that's where we get this term, the greatest conceivable being, the GCB. If you conceive him in his greatest being, his greatest existence, that would be God himself. So this was really developed by the Christian apologist Anselm of Canterbury, and it was redefined by René Descartes later on, but it has really gone through a lot of development over the last 1,000 years. The core idea behind this argument is that God, as the greatest conceivable being, must exist in reality. So here's the nature of the argument. It's an a priori argument, deducing God's existence from the concept of God itself rather than from observed facts around the world. So we have had a lot of arguments from contingency, from the evidence of design. We're looking a lot at creation for our arguments of God. This one is saying, well, if God is self-existent, let's find a internal self-existent reason for God. This goes back to the same kind of ideas about contingency versus necessity, where God is a necessary being whose non-existence is implausible. Like contingent beings, God's existence is self-explanatory. So can you conceive of a world in which you can function in thought? Can you imagine a world where that acknowledges your ability to reason, your ability to think? And with your ability to think, can you say that the world around you exists without a God? And is it possible to to think of a world that could exist without a God? The argument that the ontological argument for God's existence is making is that no, you can't. The idea of imagining a world that exists without God is simply impossible. So, in conclusion, if God can be conceived as the greatest possible being, he must exist in reality, not merely in the mind. So this is saying if you can conceive of the greatest conceivable being, then he must exist. If you can imagine a being greater than God, then God's not God, and God doesn't exist, and there is a being greater than God who does exist and is real. So here's the logic behind the argument. God can be defined as the greatest conceivable being. A being that exists in reality is greater than one that exists in the mind. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being must exist in reality. This is an argument I haven't seen used a whole lot besides William Lane Craig. I've seen him use this argument in debates effectively, and it is a argument that is just really hard to try and grapple with or debunk. If you can conceive of a world in which God doesn't exist, that doesn't mean God doesn't exist. But if you can conceive of a world in which God exists, then he is the greatest conceivable being. Now, this gets into like a big world of philosophy. If you imagine that you have 20 boxes, and in each of the 20 boxes you have a world in which God doesn't exist. But then in the 21st box, it is a world in which God does exist, then the being who exists in reality is greater than the being who exists or who doesn't exist or who exists in imagination. So for a greatest conceivable being to be possible, he has to be able to exist not just in imagination, but also in reality. Therefore, if you conceive of the greatest conceivable being, he must exist. So it's a very heady, philosophical, I don't know if the syllogisms make a whole lot of sense. And there is the argument that while the argument is valid logically, it's not necessarily true. So are you guys familiar with true versus valid? If something is valid, that means when you work through the logic of the thing, it makes sense and the syllogism checks out. If A then B, if B then C, therefore if A then C. There you have a very linear logical syllogism. That can be valid without being true, right? So you can say, I'm trying to come up with a syllogism that is valid but not true. But that's probably not worth the effort right now. I don't have one off the top of my head.
Possible and plausible.
The difference between possible and plausible, yeah. Just because it's plausible doesn't make it possible.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Come up with all sorts of explanations for things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's possible. So, like when you're doing detective work, you come up with all the possibilities and plausibilities and different things, and you work back. But just because it's possible or plausible doesn't mean that that's exactly what happened until you find out the truth of the mystery. So, yeah. I always like the ontological argument to finish out the infinite regress.
Yeah.
Because once they keep going back, you know that there has to be a cause. So what is that cause? It's the conceivable view. It just has to be.
It has to be. If you
So that's what
if you can't conceive of anything greater, then he has to exist. Yeah.
Because there has to be an answer to that infinite regress. So like in Mormonism, you're like, well, why am I not worshiping the person?
Right. Let's go back to the self-existent God that's at the beginning of
Started
everything.
it all. Let's do that one.
But Mormons never try to solve the problem of infinite regress. They just punt to mystery. Oh, it's a mystery. I don't know. Yeah.
So when someone, but there are a lot of people that are okay with the infinite regress, and they don't always sit and grapple with the GCB.
Yes, the GCB.
Not everybody does, which always blows my brain. Why didn't you ask that? But yeah, so that's the answer that I always got to. There had to have been a beginning, so then that would be the answer there. There has to be one.
And that's a great philosophical connection for the process. And I can see how that makes it a more useful argument as well.
Instead of just philosophizing about anything.
But when you work through the syllogism of it, it can be very overwhelming for people.
And I think the philosophers, brainy people, enjoy getting stuck in the minutia. Because it's fun. I love doing mental gymnastics. That's why I'm married. So that I can be rooted in reality and not just mental gymnastics.
There you go. There's benefit to that.
The guy who's building the house is an older guy. Every morning when we get for like half an hour, 45 minutes, he'd just walk around and look around. And I would just chill by the fire. And then when he would come back and say he's ready to start, there would never be any problems.
Because he kind of thought through and worked through everything.
Yeah.
And then once he started, he was doing the right thing and not
the dumb thing.
One of the 15 other things that you could have done. Yeah.
There's the SpaceX way and the NASA way.
Yes.
You try a lot of times and mess up a bunch, or you study really hard and think through everything and then you over-engineer everything. And then do the perfect first launch. instead of a bunch of catastrophes before.
Yep.
Which
Yeah.
one was the one that did the catastrophes?
Well,
Yeah, I don't want these catastrophes.
there have been a few explosions. There's a few different explosions, but I wasn't just.
Yeah, I would be the SpaceX, and my wife would be NASA. Yeah. She's definitely more methodical and careful than I am.
Okay, so NASA the one that. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, they have the army of scientists that make sure everything's perfect before they try a launch.
Yeah.
Where SpaceX is just like, we'll do as many launches as we have to until we work out the kinks. And then once all the bugs are fixed, then we'll put people on it and send them up.
They test stuff.
Yeah. Yep. So continuing with objections here, conceiving of something does not make it real, right? So I can imagine an ice cream sundae, but that doesn't make it exist in front of me, right? So Guanilo Marmortiers, or however you say that guy, critiqued Anselm's cosmological argument by proposing the idea of a perfect island. He argued that just because one can conceive of the greatest possible island does not make such an island exist in reality, showing that mere conception does not guarantee existence. So how do we respond to that? Well, we would say contingent or imaginary things, like islands, are not necessary. God, as a maximally great being, is necessary. Right? So something that's contingent, remember, this is something that has to have something else exist for it to function, to exist, to be in the world.
Well, I would think too, God isn't just conceived. We understand that he needs to be there, but then he reveals himself to us. So it's not
Right.
our imagination creating God. God has to look it up himself.
Which is where the teleological argument would be a great point, but your ontological argument does have a weakness there. Like, you're not creating God with your imagination, but if you can conceive of him, then he must exist. We can work through the last couple objections, then we'll wrap up. Another objection is from Immanuel Kant, who argued that existence is not a predicate, meaning it does not add a quality or attribute to a being. Instead, it simply affirms that the being is real rather than imagined. So we'll read that one more time. Kant argued that existence is not a predicate, meaning it does not add a quality or attribute to a being. So if you have a sentence, your subject is going to be the one doing the action, and then the predicate is going to be the one receiving the action, right? So the one receiving the action, Kant is saying that existence itself is not receiving the action from something greater, from a greater conceivable being. Instead, it simply affirms that being is rather than imagined. So being exists because you can conceive of it. So this is really one of those more heady philosophical arguments against the ontological side of things. But to respond to him, you fall back on this argument of necessity. God exists as a necessity, not as a contingency. This argument shows necessity rather than merely existence as a property. It highlights that a maximally great being cannot be contingent. So this is a great way to point out that if you do have a maximally great being, he cannot require someone to imagine him for him to exist. He existed before anyone conceived of him. He exists in and of himself. So lastly, the third objection we'll look at is the bewildering logic of it. So there are a lot of skeptics that look at this argument and they say, wow, this is really heady and philosophical, and it's going to take me a long time to work through this to even understand what you're saying. But just because it's heady and philosophical doesn't mean it's true. Like, you guys have great philosophy, but what next? To respond to that concern, you can say, even if it does not convert somebody, it does demonstrate that atheists may reject the wrong conception of God. So if people are saying, well, God doesn't exist, you can say, well, what version of God are you imagining? Like, are you understanding him to be the greatest conceivable being? Is he self-existent or is he contingent? If he's necessary and self-existent, then he must exist. But if you're imagining him as an evil God who's doing things to hurt people and is self-absorbed and arrogant and go down the line, all the accusations. Huh?
Sounds like Zeus.
That sounds like Zeus. You go down the line of all the objections that an atheist has, they're objecting to a version of Zeus and not the version of Yahweh. They're not looking at the self-existent God of the Bible. So in evangelism, this kind of helps remind us that when we're working with people, kind of have to work with them where they're at. If you have someone who is very philosophical and heady, we can say, hey, I'd be curious to hear what you think of the ontological argument. And someone who is really philosophical and likes to research things is going to go home and study that on their own. And it could open their mind to the possible existence of God. The other thing that it can do for us is to remind us that people who reject God are often not rejecting the God that we believe in. You have them describe the version of God that they think exists, and what they're going to describe is not going to be the God that you know and love. It's not going to be the God who's revealed himself in Scripture. They may have problems with the idea of God, but that God is not your God. And so for the evangelism process, sometimes it's helpful just to ask somebody, how do you imagine God? And then if they describe a God that they're angry at, who they believe doesn't exist, well, you say, well, yes, you're correct. That God doesn't exist, but my God does, and let me tell you about him. Anyway, we have another full page and a half to go through. So we'll stop there and get ready to head to the next service. Eric, would you close us with prayer?
Thank you, God, for the day. I thank you for this time that we have to listen to your word and learn from it. I pray that you will help us to think on you and put our minds on things above